Some context. This past July 11th, Mitt Romney made the first visit of any candidate in this election cycle to the great, totally non-swing state of Montana. Montana does have a close Senate race this year, but for president, Montana is not expected to be hotly contested ground. So the candidates would usually stay out of a state like that, except when they had to be there to raise money. And that's what Mitt Romney was doing there in July. He was at a fundraiser, and at that fundraiser, to his donors, Mr. Romney recounted an anecdote from his business career. And then he related that anecdote to the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Mitt Romney told the donors at this Montana event that he had had 3 rules when he ran Bain Capital. The first rule was focus. The second rule was focus. And the third rule was focus. Then Mr. Romney pulled out this presidential historical anecdote to illustrate what he said he meant by that kind of focus. Here's how Mr. Romney's remarks were quoted in the press pool report that day. The idea was put all your energy and passion at the job at hand. I heard from Secretary Jim Baker just a couple of weeks ago. He said, you know, in the first 100 days of the Reagan presidency, we had a national security meeting one day where we talked about some developments in Latin America that were of concern. And after that meeting, President Reagan called me in and said, I want no more national security meetings over the next 100 days. All of our time has to be focused on getting our economy going. Mitt Romney told this anecdote approvingly to a bunch of donors in Montana in July. This is the thing that he was praising about the Ronald Reagan presidency. It turns out that this never happened. Ronald Reagan never stopped all of his national security briefings because he said he needed to focus on the economy instead. After Mr. Romney told that story, and it was reported in the Wall Street Journal, the editor of the conservative magazine, The Weekly Standard, said that he went through the notes on Reagan's presidency from the first 100 days to check this story by Mr. Romney. He said he could find no evidence that this ever happened. James Baker himself, who Mitt Romney says he got the anecdote from, James Baker himself later told Josh Rogan at Foreign Policy magazine that Mr. Romney perhaps misunderstood the story when he told it to him. This idea that Ronald Reagan just stopped working on national security so he could focus on something more important. Mitt Romney says that happened, but it did not happen. More important than him getting the story wrong, though, is that Mr. Romney told the donors that story that day because he thought that was a good idea for what a president should do. He was using that story as a way of praising Ronald Reagan. I want no more national security meetings over the next 100 days. Wasn't that great that he did that? This is sort of amazing, right? I mean, this idea that a president could just opt out of working on national security for a while, opt out of working on foreign policy. Just say, you know what, that's not my area of focus. I need to focus on something else. When Mitt Romney suggested in July to those donors with that anecdote that that would be his approach as president, even Mr. Romney's supporters on the right got mad at him for saying that. Former George W. Bush speechwriter Mark Thiessen wrote, quote, the fact that Romney thinks it would be desirable to ignore the world for his 100 days is troubling. The aforementioned Bill Kristol at the Weekly Standard wrote, quote, the fact that Romney is recounting this anecdote does not reflect well on Romney's understanding of the job he is campaigning for. You know, I think there's no foreign policy subject in which I agree with either of those guys. They are absolutely the opposite end of the number line for me in terms of what I think America should do in the world, right? But even though I would agree with these guys on nothing else, on this, yeah, duh, I think we can all agree that foreign policy is part of the job of president, right? That trying to get out of that isn't a good plan. National security is not something a president can just say he doesn't want to work on. I mean, who's going to work on it if you don't? Actually, we have an answer for that.
We can't be all things to all people in the world, Jim. And I think that's where maybe the Vice President and I begin to have some differences. I'm worried about overcommitting our military around the world. I want to be judicious in its use. I think we got to be very careful when we commit our troops. The Vice President and I have a disagreement about the use of troops. He believes in nation building. I would be very careful about using our troops as nation builders.
Even beyond just the use of troops around the world, George Bush said when he was campaigning for the presidency in 2000, I'm not so sure the role of the United States is to go around the world and say this is the way it's got to be. We can help. Maybe it's just our difference in government, the way we view government. I mean, we want to empower people. We want to help people help themselves. I just don't think it's the role of the United States to walk into a country and say, we do it this way and so should you. That was George Bush running in 2000. Turns out you don't get to decide what sort of presidency you have. George W. Bush in the year 2000 was essentially saying he wanted to have a domestic policy presidency. Remember compassionate conservatism? I mean, his big idea about our role in the world was that we should have less of a role in the world. You don't get to decide what circumstances ultimately confront you as president. And you do not get to opt out of whole swaths of your responsibility. And some presidencies, for better or for worse, sometimes for a whole year at a time, sometimes for whole presidential terms, sometimes those presidencies end up being about America in the world and the commander-in-chief part of the job. Sometimes presidencies end up being about war. George W. Bush, I do not believe, set out to have that kind of presidency. But that is the kind of presidency that he got. And into the vacuum of his lack of any substantive ideas on foreign policy at all, into that vacuum stepped a whole very well-organized group of unelected, opportunistic, frankly, radicals, who over the course of the next 8 years brought upon this country the darkest, most radical, most disastrous foreign policy in American history. And we are not over it. Now, while we are in the 12th year of one of the wars started in that era, the Republican Party is offering another choice for president who is promising a non-foreign policy presidency. Republican presidential nominee Mitt Romney did not mention the issue of foreign policy in his closing statement at the foreign policy debate last night. This is not his field, and he is not pretending that it is. He doesn't want it to be his field. Nobody has perfect foresight about what their presidency is going to be like, what they're going to have the option of working on or not working on. But the pressing nature of this issue now is that it's not hypothetical. It's not about seeing into the future and guessing about something that maybe might happen. It's about seeing what's going on right now. We are still actively coping with one of the foreign policy disasters left over from the last time a guy said he didn't really want to work on this as an issue. Even if you just take the issue of Afghanistan, which you will have to take on if you want to be president, this was the Republican nominee's position on Afghanistan right up until last night.
In Afghanistan, the surge was right. But announcing a withdrawal date, that was wrong. The Taliban may not have watches, but they do have calendars.
I think the biggest mistakes he's made in Afghanistan were, one, announcing the specific date that we would withdraw.
This president has done an extraordinary thing. He announced the date of our withdrawal. He announced the date of the withdrawal of our surge forces based upon a political calendar, not the calendar that the commanders on the ground said it was based for our mission. That was wrong.
That was wrong. As recently as 2 weeks ago, Mitt Romney's position on Afghanistan is that announcing a date for withdrawing from Afghanistan was the biggest mistake that President Obama had made. It was wrong. Then last night,
We're going to be finished by 2014, and when I'm president, we'll make sure we bring our troops out by the end of 2014.
It's the biggest mistake President Obama had ever made to espouse that policy. Mitt Romney, forget it. I'll espouse it too. I don't really feel like talking about it. I mean, listen, Afghanistan is not the only issue confronting the president, even just on international affairs. But to go from being the guy who did not mention the war at all in your convention speech, and who didn't mention veterans in your convention speech, to being the guy who still made no mentions of veterans last night, even as President Obama went back and talked about veterans 6 or 7 times, still nothing from Mitt Romney, to be then unveiling a 180-degree turn on your Afghanistan policy 2 weeks before the election, an election that will decide if you become the commander of the troops in the war you are ignoring, to unveil a 180-degree turn in your policy on the war 2 weeks before the election, as if that is something that requires no explanation and you're just assuming people don't care enough about it to notice. I use this term with hesitance, but that reflects a certain lack of seriousness about something that every single day affects 68,000 American families directly. 68,000 American families who have real, unmetaphorical skin in the game right now because a family member of theirs is in Afghanistan, which is our war. 68,000 Americans whose lives will be in Mitt Romney's hands if he gets elected on the basis of saying he doesn't really care what happens there because he can't be bothered to come up with a coherent position on it. This is not a question of whether you agree with Mitt Romney or if you disagree with Mitt Romney on whatever his policy of the moment is. The amazing thing here, and the reason I think last night's debate was really important, is that the Republican Party, just 4 years after George W. Bush, the Republican Party has nominated somebody to be president who just doesn't seem to take this part of being president seriously. He doesn't seem to care too much about this as a matter of policy. And he doesn't think that you do either. He doesn't think it's relevant to your decision about whether or not to elect him. A group of Mitt Romney foreign policy advisors told the New York Times earlier this month that even they are not sure that Mr. Romney even reads his campaign's own briefing materials for him on the subject of foreign policy. We saw Mr. Romney insist last night, and not for the first time, that Syria is Iran's route to the sea. For the record, Iran and Syria are real countries that exist in a specific place on the map. Look, over there on the right, the big one, that's Iran. Over there on the left, the little one, that's Syria. Notice they do not touch. Notice also, yeah, there is a sea over by Syria, but Iran has some access of its own. Syria is Iran's path to the sea? What are you talking about? And it's not that he just flubbed this. It's not that he just got it wrong this one time. He's thinking of something else. He said this 4 or 5 times. And there hasn't been a corrective. The Republican campaign for the presidency this year apparently thinks that this is so unimportant, they have never even bothered to try to get it right. They've never checked it. The nominee himself apparently doesn't care enough about being called out on a subject like this to make sure that he's not called out on it again. And bother to look at a map. We know that you carry an iPad. There's Google Maps on there, or even Apple Maps, which might blur it. But look, there's an ocean below Iran. It's blue. Have you heard of the Persian Gulf? Do you know what Persia means? It's the not caring about getting it right that is the big new thing here. The I'm not going to try to win this debate. The I'm not going to bother having any coherent policies thing. I'm not going to mention the war. It's not on my laundry list of things that I find important for a speech like this. Nobody's judging me on this. It's this idea that this is just not the kind of presidency that you choose to have. Ronald Reagan chose to not work on national security. You don't get that choice. That didn't really happen about Ronald Reagan. You made that up. This is one job where you don't get the choice. There's nothing in the commander-in-chief portfolio of responsibilities that can be delegated to somebody else. And when people try, we get historic disasters in this country. And the fact that you've brought on all of the same whirlwind of advisors who reaped this disaster when a disinterested president named George W. Bush had the same attitude about this as you do, that is why it is a good thing for this country that the last word before voting that we got collectively as a nation was the chance to hear you forced to talk about foreign policy. Mitt Romney said his big idea on Iran last night was that he wants to indict the Iranian president for genocide. Who's going to go arrest him exactly? Mr. Romney's running mate today is still trying to get away with saying he didn't vote for the proposed defense cuts that are called the sequester, which he's been criticizing on the campaign trail. He says he didn't vote for those, which leads us to the question of who forged his name in the congressional record then. Whether or not you agree with that vote or not, whether your politics are like mine or whether your politics are like Bill Kristol's or whether they are somewhere in between, that's a large distance. The problem here is that the Republican Party has run a ticket for president that seems to think that this does not matter. They don't even care enough to try on this subject. Just say anything. Nobody's counting on you to really understand it or even really believe what you're saying. They do not think there is any political cost to barely phoning this in. The commander-in-chief thing, the commander-in-chief test that everybody talks about, it's a stupid beltway term, right? But the commander-in-chief thing is a real thing. It's not just a poetic synonym for the president. You don't get to opt out. And if you're going to try, you cannot just hope that we don't notice, even 2 weeks out. Dan Rather joins us next.